Chapter 1 Addiseg, Scotland, April 26, 1746, 10 days after the Battle of Culloden.
Do you prefer a two-armed corpse or a one-armed husband with a beaten heart?
The grizzled surgeon raised a bottle of whiskey to his lips and guzzled deeply, waiting for Adina's answer. She looked down at James, lying stiffly on the long wooden table. Outside, the bitter wind flapped the walls of the canvas tent. She searched for the eyes of her husband in the receding light. When they did flutter open briefly, they were hollow and black.
"James,"
she whispered, lowering her head close to his face.
"I don't want.
She touched her swollen stomach.
We don't want to lose you."
She laid a hand on his forehead. He was burning up. He moaned quietly, then gasped in a struggle for air.
Madam.
The surgeon pressed her again. He wiped his lips with his filthy sleeve, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. She wasn't sure what to make of this man who had suddenly appeared in the Jacobite camp with his bag of medical tools and potions. Adina hesitated.
"I'm not sure."
She knew James was supposed to die on board the Ballon, the French ship she'd shoved him off just last week. He would die of a fever sometime in May, she recalled from the Wikipedia article that was burned into her brain. She closed her eyes and the date came to her. 13 May, 1746. She looked again at James's left arm. It was deeply bruised from the yellow gash near his shoulder where he'd been hit by a lead ball at Culloden, all the way down to his blackened, trembling fingers. He was supposed to die of his injuries on board that ship. Adina gently touched his exposed shoulder. Black pus oozed from the wound. James cried out, but the sound was barely audible, like the whimper of a wounded animal about to be put down. She stood up and turned back to the surgeon.
"You've done this before, Mr. Anderson."
She couldn't bring herself to call him doctor.
He grinned and spat on the floor. Aye, madam, certainly I have. He rubbed his chin and looked at James lying on the table. If we dinna amputate, you'll sure lose him, maybe tonight. James suddenly cried out, Catherine!
Adina crouched down again, bringing her face close to him.
"I'm here."
She kissed his cheek and held her lips to his rough face. He was shaking.
Catherine,
he whispered again. Then he was still. She could feel him fading away. Adina stood up and turned to Anderson.
"Okay, take his arm." Ottawa, Canada, April 26, 2019. Catherine sat up straight, staring at the tall paper vessel of hot tea, the freshly baked raisin scone, and the little chunk of butter that sat beside it, enshrined in gold foil.
Adina, where are you? Tara laughed.
Catherine smiled at the dark-haired beauty sitting beside the bed, who had reintroduced herself and delivered a bounty of delicious delights.
Just enjoying heaven, Miss Tara. Heaven? Well, Dee, I guess maybe a hospital could seem like that after everything you must have seen these past months.
Catherine sipped the tea. My goodness, such heavenly taste. It was some kind of sweetly exotic flavour, topped with freshly whipped cream, and the warm pastry, brought surely from a hot oven nearby. She took a bite of the scone, savouring the taste and the warmth melting in her mouth. She closed her eyes and smiled. Dying is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Are you really back, Dee? Or are you still...
Ring, ring. The sound of bells emanated from Tara's handbag.
Wonder who that is?
Miss Tara asked, lifting her bag and extracting a small, flat, pink object. She looked down at it.
It's Philippe. Hey! Where are you?
Catherine sipped her tea, watching Tara. Who was she talking to? It seemed to be the object itself, but that didn't make any sense. As Catherine listened, she got the feeling Tara was talking to someone for whom she had great affection. In heaven, Catherine reasoned, the world is full of wonder, and many things were quite beyond her understanding. She finished the raisin scone in a few bites and watched Tara talking into the thing.
Yes, Philippe, I'm here with her now.
Philippe? Was that one of the men she had met a few days ago? There were so many of them in heaven. They all had such white teeth, smooth skin, and their fragrance. Oh, it made her heart flutter. They smelled so clean and captivating, so spicy and fresh. Maybe one of them was meant to be hers, a companion to make paradise complete.
Oliver Anderson never thought it would be this easy. When he had learned of the £1,000 sterling reward for capturing a Jacobite officer, he left his tiny village of Lochailart in search of a prize. There were rumours of rebels hiding in the hills, but he thought it more likely they'd try to escape by sea. He was right. At the only inn in Arisig, after a day's ride from his farm in Lochailart, he heard whispers of a camp of rebels. Some were wounded, waiting for a ship to escape from Scotland before they were found. The most seriously injured men were desperate to find a surgeon. His satchel of carpenter tools and his bottles of spirits should do the job. Now he needed to work fast. The wife of James Drummond had refused to leave her husband's side until he sent her to fetch blankets. He likely couldn't carry his prize all the way to Fort William on foot, but if he could disable Drummond, preferably without killing him, Anderson could return with Hanoverian soldiers. The lieutenant of the Pretender, the so-called Duke of Perth, would fetch a handsome reward. Maybe he could negotiate an extra £1,000 for a traitor of such rank. Anderson glanced at his tools, a saw, a file, a hammer, and 2 bottles of whiskey. If he made a mess sawing off the arm, Drummond might die before he could return to claim the gold. Cutting off Drummond's foot would be much better. The Duke's wife would keep him alive, and there was little chance he'd be able to run very far from here.
Catherine closed her eyes as she drew the bow against the strings of the old cello. The music welled up inside her, aching for her fingers to release these dark tones across the heavens. She coaxed out each note slowly and deliberately until they washed over her like a sorrowful embrace. Somehow, Maestro Duncan's cello had followed her to this new world. Her song, the one she had struggled with at Kinnaird when she was among the living, now rose from her stringed companion. Words echoed in her head. Had they come to her in a dream?
Gone is my heart without you. Now I am lost once again.
She whispered, tentatively mouthing the phrases that filled her mind. The words eloquently intertwined with the music, draining and inspiring her at the same time. She rode the wave of emotion that poured from her, ending with a final crescendo. Her head sagged, tears washed her face. The voice of a man spoke gently.
Your music, it's so powerful. Like you.
She opened her eyes and looked at the face staring at her. It was the same man who had brought her the cello, Philippe. He had been summoned by the dark-haired one, Tara. She stood behind him, holding that pink toy she carried everywhere. She used her thumbs to touch it and play with it, never looking up. Merci, Philippe. Catherine sensed he was French because of how Tara had pronounced his name. Philippe. Je suis vraiment humiliée. Philippe, sitting close beside Catherine in the little room near her bed, touched her hand, then leaned closer and kissed both her cheeks. Warmth spread over her face. Tara put down her pink toy and stood up. Her face looked a little flushed too.
Adina stood. Hands off my man.
Philippe chuckled, but kept his eyes on Catherine. It's nice to hear you speak French again. I'd forgotten how good you were. Now if you could sing en français, we'd be in real trouble.
Catherine sighed at the sight of his smile, and his penetrating eyes felt as if they looked deep inside her. Tara slid her chair closer, motioning for Philippe to move. He dragged his chair aside, and Tara drew up closer to Catherine.
Dee, we brought you the Duncan just like you wanted, but it's got to go back soon. Back?
Catherine was confused.
To where? To Edinburgh. You know, Museum Scotland. We're supposed to return it on the 17th, but after what happened, they gave us a few extra weeks to sort things out. But isn't that my cello? Did it get sold?
Philippe stood up and laughed. Oui, madame. To the highest bidder. He touched Catherine's shoulder. You've been gone too long, but it's so good to have you back.
He smiled again, his white teeth and dark eyes, his perfect skin, and that musky fragrance. Had he just bathed?
I have to run, ladies. Interview at noon on the radio, he said, slipping on a leather coat.
Radio?
Her French was good, but not that good. À la prochaine, she sang out as he turned to leave. Tara stood up and put her arms around Philippe. She kissed his lips lightly.
Later, he said, and walked away.
Hopefully, Catherine thought with a smile, he will return soon, when the dark-haired one is gone.
Adina wondered where she could find blankets as she stood outside the surgeon's tent. Was she doing the right thing letting him take James's arm? It was so hard to know if she could affect the future. Nothing she had done since she had become Catherine Carnegie, and then Lady Catherine Drummond had prevented the Battle of Culloden or changed its outcome. And although she'd pushed James from the Bellone, it didn't seem as if he was going to survive. Anderson, the surgeon, was just not...
Sister!
A voice broke her thoughts. It was Catherine's brother George running towards her like a crazed animal.
Where's James? He screamed.
With that surgeon, Anderson, in the tent. I need to get blankets for...
He's no surgeon, George interrupted as he stopped in front of her at the entrance to the tent.
What? Oh God, I left James alone with him.
George pulled open the flap of the tent and pulled his sword free of its sheath. Stop!
Adina followed and to her horror saw there was a rope around James's neck. He was laying on the table with one of his boots and socks off. Anderson gripped a rusty wood saw in one hand, while he held James's exposed leg firmly in place with the other. He sneered.
Too late. He lowered the blade on James's bare ankle and dragged it back roughly over his skin.
George flew across the room toward Anderson, knocking him away. Adina rushed to her husband. The saw's rusty teeth had ripped through the skin of his ankle. Blood oozed from the wound. She covered it with her own hand, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. George and Anderson rolled on the floor of the tent, each man trying to land a blow against the other. Finally, George pinned Anderson down, but struggled to hold the wiry man to the ground. Anderson flayed back and forth and kicked George between the legs. Adina picked up a knife sitting on the table. Suddenly, Anderson broke free from George and scrambled toward Adina. She brandished the long knife at him.
You butcher!
She would gladly plunge the knife into his neck if he took another step closer. Anderson studied Adina for a moment, and then slowly crept back towards the open flap of the tent. He sneered at Adina and George, who finally managed to get back on his feet.
I'll be back, Anderson growled. "Nae going to lose my £1,000. You can try and hide, but we'll hunt you down and find ye." With that, he turned and fled from the tent. "We can't stay here," George gasped. "Your husband's too big a prize."